Hello there, it's time for another Nordic Neanderthal video. Today I have some video editing software downloading, so I'll be overlaying some relevant images over certain parts of the audio to this video that will hopefully give you a better idea of what I'm talking about graphically. So today we're talking about the Solutrean culture of Europe, and then about the Solutrean Hypothesis, which is a theory that coincides with coincidental with the migration of Amerindians from Siberia. There was a migration from Europe of the Solutrean culture, and we'll come to various reasons. The reason the theory was initially posited, and the genetic support for the theory that has since appeared. It's not actually a mainstream theory, even though, in my eyes, and you'll see why, the evidence is overwhelming. I do provide at the end for a little balance. I don't feel it's well balanced, so I may do another video in future where I try to find some stronger counter-arguments. So as I was saying, I have included a study at the end, which I'll give you the name and the publication date of. That's for the counter-arguments. So, with that said, let's jump into it. And so the Solutrean is a tool culture, because the distinctions in the tool-making process are what characterizes the periods of the Stone Age. Lytic Reduction is the characteristic of the Solutrean culture, and it's relatively advanced method whereby bifacial stones are made by chipping pieces off of the rock with usually a hammer, something like a hammer, something that functions as a hammer. You chip pieces off until you come up with a portion that can be used to make a sharp-bladed tool. So this, it was the most advanced culture, tool culture, since the Neanderthals, because after the Homo sapiens invaded Europe, there was a drop in the class, the skill involved in the making of the tools present for some time. So something that's interesting that I'll come to later when we talk about the Americas is this technique taken to its nth degree, which resulted in a very interesting phenomenon called Eccentric Flint, which was something that was mastered especially by the Mayan civilization, but assuming it got there through the Solutrean, it would have come from North America in very early history, and I mean there is evidence to suggest that most or all of the Amerindian populations, north and south, have some descent from a population that was admixed with these Solutreans, although X is more or less the X Mtdna that we'll come to talk about, which is associated with the culture, at least by proponents of the theory, and you'll see why it's associated. That is mostly found in the north, and especially in the northeast. That's where it's significant. So Teotihuacan in Mexico was found to have obsidian examples of the eccentric flint technique, which is interesting. It means it was present there, for a long time prior to that urban centre's conception. Right, so in Europe, the Solutrean is a period dated about 22,000 years before the present to about 17,000 years before the present. It follows the Gravettian and in turn the Aurignacian period, which follows the Neanderthal Mysterian. So it's the third period of human culture in the west of Europe, and the main sites are in Spain, Portugal, and France. The two type sites are in France, and There are also what have been called proto-Solutrean sites in England. You'll see later that there's a refugium of the associated X Mtdna in the Faroe Islands, which shows it was present in the British Isles. That is X, and there's a site in Derbyshire called Cresswell Crags that has been called a proto-Solutrean fine toolmaking site. So the question is where the Solutrean culture and X Mtdna, which you'll see the association of, came from, and we'll get to that shortly. First, just an introduction to X Mtdna. X Mtdna is a West Eurasian group. It is dispersed throughout European peoples, but the only nation in which it's significant is Turkey, where it's up to 5%, about 5%. It's highest in the Druze, where it reaches up to 13% in some communities, about 16% in others, depending on which nation. The Druze are split into Israeli Druze and Syrian Druze, and there's another national community as well. But more on the Druze briefly. We cover a study which talks about the dispersal of X, and we have a brief quote from another study which mentions the Druze specifically. So, prior to the Solutrean period, unfortunately, regarding the Solutrean period, we only have one DNA find, and that's an example of mtDNA-U. mtDNA-U was one of the most common in a lot of Cro-Magnon groups anyway. Prior to the Solutrean period, in the Gravettian, we have prevalence of F and C, FC and I. C, Y-DNA, this is C, Y-DNA was dominant in Iberia, but I was present, and later on in history we see a shift to I in Iberia itself, to I2 specifically. But F is present, C is dominant in the area before this period, and I becomes dominant later in terms of Y-DNA. mtDNA, U, as I've said, is found in Solutreans. X, we haven't found any Solutreans of X because we've only got one mtDNA sample and no Y-DNA samples. But at least if the theory checks out, then it makes sense. And given that Iberia seems to be the historical tie culturally between this tool culture in the Amerindias and the Levant, where a lot of the cultures originated, and which is the other hotspot of the mtDNA, it seems to have been historically present. So there was mtDNA N and R asterisk, and asterisk is usually used in haplotype names to show something that was earlier, so it's a proto-R. R was ancestral to most West Eurasian groups, N was ancestral to all North Eurasian groups. This is mtDNA now. So in the Proto-Aurignacian we have the ancestral group of North Eurasians and the one that's specifically ancestral to West Eurasians. Then later we have M and U. Now M is interesting. M and its descendants are not found in Europe, but they were during the certain parts of this Cro-Magnon period during the Gravettian. And U as well, various clades of U. As I said, U was the commonest in diverse groups of Cro-Magnons and others, also in Indo-Europeans later. So the Solutrean Hypothesis was founded by a chap called Dennis J. Stanford, he died recently, but he used to work for the Smithsonian Institute, which was and still is one of the primary institutions in relation to Paleao-Archaeology and anthropology, physical anthropology. So yeah, he came up with this hypothesis, and the reason he came up with this hypothesis is that the Clovis culture, if you remember the tool culture I mentioned, the Clovis culture has a very similar tool-making method, and it appears after earlier, more primitive cultures. and it's concentrated around the northeastern region, but it spreads throughout the whole of North America and then has a knock-on effect throughout the Americas. I'll show some images here of the different types. There are, you can see the Solutrean tool types in general, and then you can see Clovis points, so spear tips, arrow tips made with this method. As I said, it gives a sharper, more well-defined blade than more primitive methods. So the appearance of this culture was what was initially the reason for proposing the theory, and then we've got X Mtdna seemingly proving the theory. The problems people highlight with the theory are that the Clovis period started 13,000 to 11,000, which is 4,000 odd years after. This is all BP, before present, so 4,000 or so years after the end of the Solutrean in Western Europe. But there can be various reasons for that. It can be because we haven't found all of the sites yet, but given that these finds are quite common in the Americas, it may simply be maybe it was a population with an advanced technique that was confined to a smaller area for a while. I'll have to study in more detail the Paleo-American finds, because if I can look at the shapes and see the progression, whether there was progression or whether it was a sudden emergence, as it seems, I can give a more in-depth perspective. So the main problem is this 4,000 year gap. The other challenge is autosomal inheritance. So the majority of the DNA, again, the autosomes, have been tested in the two examples I'll come to later of Paleo-Amerindians, and both have been found to be closest to the Siberians who crossed the ice bridge from the east. There's a huge problem with that theory in that, with that as being used as evidence that there was no Solutrean population, in that if the Solutrean population's presence is mostly shown genetically through minor maternities, maternities at the level of 10% or so, if you have a patriarchal society and a tenth of the women from the prior society remain, there's not going to be much of their DNA left over, so they will automatically be closer to their other ancestors by a long, long way. So because they didn't release the full autosomal results, it's problematic. I will check to see if there are examples on GEDmatch. GEDmatch is a great service. If you haven't signed up, I would suggest do an ancestry test and get a GEDmatch account, because there's huge amounts you can do in terms of comparing current populations, ancient pop samples and populations. GEDmatch is a great tool. We've got a period afterwards called the Azilian in Europe, which, as I said earlier, was I2, and U5 has also been found. So that's just context for what happens after the Solutrean period, the transition. But because we don't know the Y-DNA of the Solutrean, and we've only found a U-mtdna, we can't really say whether they were I2 or whether they were the C that dominated priorly, but it's likely they were either I2 or C Y-DNA. So typical Cro-Magnon paternity. The two examples, we have one called Anzik, who was an infant, who was found in Montana, had Y-DNA, as is typical for Amerindians, so that suggests a Siberian descent, and he had D-mtdna, D4 specifically, which is again from East Asia. The thing about Anzik is that Anzik is very early in the Clovis period, which is associated. So it may well be that he was one of the newcomers who had adopted the culture, but wasn't of that stock in any large part. And again, we don't have the autosomes, so all we can tell is that his direct paternity and direct maternity were not, so he could have had another branch of the family that was related to these Solutrean people. because they haven't released the autosomes, we can't check that for ourselves. The Kennewick Man was another example. This is an example that supports the theory. Kennewick Man was found in Washington. Again, the autosomes were suggested to be much closer to East Asians and Siberians, but he was found to have Q as well, so he's also of paternal descent from those who crossed from East Asia, but he carried mtDNA X2A, and the particular clade of X2A that exists in the Amerindian population. But X2A doesn't seem to have diverged that distantly in history, which again supports this theory. Anyway, so that was found in Washington. The interesting thing is these were both found out towards the west. The culture was concentrated in the northeast, but these showed that it had spread there fairly early on. As I said, Anzig is right at the beginning of the period. Kennewick is a little while afterwards in the main period. Coming back to mtDNA X, it's 13.1% in the group of Druze that our first study studied. They focused on a group in Galilee, but I think they focused on a couple of different groups. The study is called The Druze, a Population Genetic Refugium in the Near East. It's from May the 7th, 2008. Here I have a quote from them where they say, "An attractive hypothesis to explain this geographic concentration of lineages, which diverged remotely within an ancient haplogroup, which are not identified in other populations of the region, is that these Galilee Druze individuals represent the refugium of an ancestral group with high diversity and high frequency of haplogroup X, which was more prevalent in the region in antiquity, and from which the global diversity of X mtDNA haplogroup emerged." So, just as it may have been higher in the region of the North Levant priorly, it may also have, certainly was if this theory was correct, much higher in Iberia, where it would have been one of the significant groups, and now it's a trace group. So yeah, and then we have another study which we've got quite a few quotes from. It's called Origin and Diffusion of mtDNA Haplogroup X. It's from November 2003. Here we note, this is something interesting, the Israeli Druze have 15.6% X, like I said, almost 16%. The Moroccans, I include here, the Moroccans have 1.1%, which isn't awfully high, but if the Solutreans were X, as I would propose, it's not surprising that someone in the same region, just over the sea, would have, above 1% of the maternal group. Okay, here they say, it is notable that X2 includes 2 complete Native American X sequences that constitute the distinctive X2A clade, a clade that lacks close relatives in the entire Old World, including Siberia. The position of X2A in the phylogenetic tree suggests an early split from other X2 clades, likely at the very beginning of their expansion and spread from the Near East. And then they go on to say, haplogroup X is an exception to this pattern of limited geographical distribution. It is found generally at low frequencies in both West Eurasians, some northern groups of Native Americans. But intriguingly, it is absent from North Siberian and East Asian populations, which are genetically and geographically closest to those of Native Americans. Among Siberians, haplogroup X mtDNAs have only been detected in some Altaian populations of southwestern Siberia. And they do say in the study as well that this was not of the same clade. So they go on to say, 3 exceptions include the Druze, the Georgians, and the Orkney Islanders, among whom the frequency of X2 reaches 11%, 8%, and 7% respectively. So again, with the Orkney Islanders, who I said I'd mentioned, that it's Solutreans in the British Isles. I've just raised a question about that. It may well have been, because if it was present throughout the Western Atlantic and spread to the Amerindians, you would have thought it would have spread to Britain as well. These findings leave unanswered the question of the geographic source of Native American X2A in the Old World. Although our analysis provides new clues about the time of arrival of haplogroup X in the Americas. And then they go on to their conclusions, and in the conclusions they actually say, third, the few Altean and Siberian haplogroup X lineages are not related to the Native American cluster. They are more likely explained by recent gene flow from Europe or West Asia. So there they have given us a conclusion, essentially, because they've said it's likely that the presence of X, the current presence of X in certain West Siberians is later, and thus that it's likely that the Solutrean hypothesis was actually correct. So they've said it without saying it in this paper. Now, I did say I would provide a counterpoint to counter-argument by way of a study. This study, I'll give you the name again because I would really recommend you read it. It's a great study. I've highlighted the key bits, but it's good to read the whole thing for context. So it was Origin and Diffusion of mtDNA Haplogroup X, November 2003. The one that contests the point is not very well written and doesn't have any backing, in my view. It just basically says you don't have any evidence for your argument. So it's very strange for an academic paper, but it's called Does Mitochondrial Haplogroup X Indicate Ancient Transatlantic Migration to the Americas? A Critical Re-Evaluation, 6th of November 2016. These studies you can find on NCBI and PLOS ONE. For the images I'll be overlaying, I will provide credits in the About section. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed. Just a last minute outtake to remind you to sub and share, help the channel grow, and the quality, I promise, will grow as the channel grows. I am getting to grips with this editing software, and I will have a professional editor once the channel's grown somewhat. Cheers, thanks, bye. PPS, if you like. Tomorrow I will do the video the other way around. I'm going to draw a series of maps that explain human migrations as a whole, and I'll do a few very short burst videos and put them together in a playlist. So that should hopefully be enjoyable viewing. Thank you. Bye.